Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe grab some tea, preferably not laced with mercury though, because, as we'll soon learn, that was a bit of a thing back then. Tonight, we're drifting softly into one of history's quieter corners. The kind of place where family portraits look serene, but behind those gilded frames, people were quietly losing their minds. This is the story of how the noble classes, kings, queens, and assorted blue-blooded disasters hid their madness. Not from the world, exactly, because the world didn't always care, but from each other, from gossip, from scandal, from the fear that if anyone knew how unwell their family really was, their entire dynasty might crumble overnight. So tonight, we're gliding back to the candlelit halls of Europe, a place where insanity wasn't treated. It was wallpapered over. Let's start somewhere familiar. The 18th century, when powdered wigs were high and mental health awareness was, well, low. If someone in the lower classes started showing signs of mental illness, they'd usually end up in a public asylum. These were not nice places. The walls echoed with screaming, and the treatments ranged from ice baths to exorcisms. But if a noble started acting a little off, muttering to themselves, refusing to eat, or claiming to be made of glass, you couldn't exactly throw them in with the common lunatics, could you? That would be unseemly. So noble families developed their own system, private confinement. They built quiet little wings in their estates, or they paid handsomely to rent out a discreet suite in a monastery, where troublesome relatives could be gently forgotten. These weren't always dungeons. Sometimes they were quite nice, elegant rooms with windows, servants, even gardens. It's just that the person inside wasn't allowed to leave. One of the earliest and most chilling examples of this comes from France, because, of course it does. Let's meet Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad. He ruled France in the late 14th century, and for the first few years, things went surprisingly well. He was young, handsome, and everyone thought he might actually fix the mess his father left behind. But then, something cracked. During a military campaign in 1392, Charles suddenly turned on his own men and attacked them. He killed several before his attendants managed to restrain him. After that, his mind seemed to shatter for good. Sometimes he couldn't remember who he was. Other times, he believed he was made of glass, genuinely terrified that a touch might shatter him. Court physicians, being very helpful, suggested everything from purging to bloodletting to locking him in a dark room until he calmed down. Spoiler, he didn't. So the French court did what it would do many times again. They hid him. His apartments were transformed into a kind of royal madhouse, courtiers whispered. The queen pretended everything was fine, and a web of regents quietly took over the kingdom. For over 40 years, France was ruled by a man who drifted in and out of psychosis, and everyone just worked around it. Let's drift forward a few centuries to Spain, where the royal gene pool had been stirred about as much as a brick. The Habsburgs are the gold standard of inbred royalty. They married cousins, nieces, and sometimes uncomfortably close relatives, until their family tree looked more like a tangled grapevine. One of their more tragic products was Charles II of Spain, often nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles was born in 1661, and from the start, he was not well. His lower jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't properly chew his food. He had one testicle, chronic intestinal problems, and a brain that seemed to function in slow motion. By age 10, he still couldn't read. By 20, he was barely coherent. But remember, this was the king of Spain. The court couldn't admit he was incapable. So they built a fantasy world around him. Ministers forged his signature. Servants carried him from room to room. And every time he had a seizure or collapsed in prayer, they said it was the work of witchcraft, because apparently it was easier to believe he was cursed than to admit that maybe centuries of cousin marriage had taken their toll as time went on. Hiding madness became a kind of aristocratic tradition. The 17th and 18th centuries were full of what we might call private asylums, quiet country houses run by doctors who promised confidentiality. In England, one of the most famous was Dr. Francis Willis, who made a small fortune treating wealthy lunatics. His patients included none other than King George III, the man whose breakdown famously led to the Regency era. George's illness began around 1788. And if you've seen The Madness of King George, you know it wasn't pretty. He talked endlessly, wrote incoherent letters, and tried to shake hands with trees. When the royal doctors failed, Dr. Willis was called in, a country physician with strong opinions and even stronger leather restraints. His treatment involved cold baths, tight clothing to restrict movement, and long lectures about morality. And while that sounds awful, it sort of worked. George recovered enough to resume his duties, at least for a while. So, Dr. Willis became a celebrity, the go-to guy for discreet, aristocratic insanity. He even treated members of the French and Austrian nobility who quietly crossed the channel to avoid local gossip. Because nothing says therapy like being chained in a Georgian farmhouse by a guy who believes prayer cures schizophrenia. But let's float to France again, because when it came to secrets, they perfected the art by the 1700s. The lettre de cachet had become a tool of quiet social control. This was a royal warrant signed by the king, allowing anyone, literally anyone, to be imprisoned without trial. All you needed was money and a good excuse. Your husband's embarrassing brother talks to invisible angels. Send him away. Your wife is too hysterical at parties. Lock her up. Your cousin insists he's Napoleon before Napoleon exists. No problem. Some of these people ended up in the Bastille, but many were placed in comfortable convents or private chateaux. The family would tell friends that the relative had gone abroad or fallen ill or entered deep spiritual reflection. In reality, they were quietly imprisoned for life. There's a particularly sad case of the Marquis de Sade's wife, who used one of these letters to have him confined because, well, he was the Marquis de Sade, but the system was also used against gentle souls who'd done nothing wrong, just mentally ill, inconvenient, or too emotional. Across Europe, noble families created their own hidden institutions. In Austria, the Habsburgs maintained secret rooms in monasteries for unstable relatives. In Russia, Catherine the Great's court quietly locked away nobles who showed signs of madness, often under the pretext of retirement. And in Prussia, Frederick William I famously built a house of correction for wayward aristocrats. It sounds like a reform school, but in practice, it was part asylum, part prison, part moral re-education camp. the 18th century version of "Let's fix him" by yelling "discipline." Let's drift over to England again, where the nobility's obsession with secrecy reached its most refined form: the country house asylum. These were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were estates, sometimes picturesque, sometimes bleak, where a handful of wealthy patients could live out their days quietly. Staff were instructed to never speak of their charges. Carriages arrived only at night. It was like an exclusive spa, except you weren't allowed to leave, and the treatment involved a lot of bleeding and herbal calming tonics. One particularly discreet example was Ticehurst House. Founded in 1792, it catered exclusively to the upper class. Patients were referred to as guests. They had fine furniture, servants, gardens, and a total lack of freedom. The idea was that madness could be cured by comfort and isolation, as long as no one knew about it. For families, the benefit was simple. Their reputations remained spotless. The neighbor's daughter might have gone to the country for her health, but in truth, she was pacing the halls of a private asylum, reading outdated prayer books, and wondering what she'd done wrong. There's something eerily modern about this, isn't there? The idea of covering up illness to maintain appearances. Except in the 18th century, appearances were practically a matter of national security. A royal family with a mad heir could face rebellion. A noble lineage with tainted blood. So, the logic was simple. Hide it, lock it up, and never speak of it again. But the cracks always showed eventually. One of the strangest examples of hereditary madness came from the Wettin dynasty of Saxony. By the 1800s, they'd accumulated a gallery of eccentrics, men who talked to furniture, women who refused to eat, princes who believed they were chickens. Yes, literally chickens. These relatives were confined to quiet castles under medical supervision. Visitors were rare, and official portraits never mentioned their existence. In some cases, their names were even erased from Genel. It's a pattern we see again and again, the disappearing relative. Every noble family had one. The aunt who never married and preferred solitude. The cousin who took holy orders at 17 and was never seen again. The brother who went traveling in Italy and somehow never returned. It's easy to romanticize history, the dresses, the palaces, the powdered hair. But behind those facades, there was deep, constant fear of being different. Let's drift softly to one more story before we pause for the night. In the early 19th century, the Bavarian royal family faced a problem named King Ludwig II. He's often remembered as the Mad King of Bavaria, though in truth, he was more eccentric than insane. Ludwig built castles, vast, dreamlike structures, including the famous Neuschwanstein. He loved opera, hated politics, and preferred to dine alone in candlelight, while servants lowered food through hidden mechanisms so he wouldn't have to see them. His ministers decided he was mentally unfit. In 1886, they declared him insane without ever examining him. He was taken to Lake Starnberg under guard, and within days, he was dead. Officially, he drowned. Unofficially, it looked a lot like the Bavarian elite decided their whimsical king was bad for business. It's a reminder that sometimes madness wasn't just mental illness. It was any behavior that made the establishment uncomfortable. And so, for centuries, European aristocracy maintained its careful balance, decadent on the surface, quietly disturbed beneath. Let's pause here. in the flickering candlelight of old Europe, where sanity was a performance, and the real tragedies were hidden behind silk curtains. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the 19th century, when private asylums became big business and noble madness became strangely fashionable. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're not, that's fine too. Tonight, we're gliding quietly into the 19th century, an era that liked to think it had everything figured out. Science, progress, manners, and an endless supply of lace. But underneath the lace, under all that polished civility, the aristocracy still had a problem. The problem of madness. And by now, they'd gotten very good at pretending it didn't exist, you see. By the 1800s, madness had become trendy, not to have it, of course, but to talk about it, to study it, and to treat it in the most genteel way possible. Public asylums were now huge. Grim buildings filled with the poor, industrial warehouses for the unwanted, but for the wealthy. A new industry emerged, the private lunatic asylum. Think of it as the aristocratic version of a wellness retreat. Except, instead of yoga and smoothies, you got morphine, leeches, and long walks under supervision. One of the most famous of these was the Retreat in York. Founded by the Quakers in the late 18th century, it was based on something called moral treatment, the idea that gentle surroundings, kindness, and structure could restore sanity. It was revolutionary at the time, and it worked. Sometimes so, naturally, the upper classes adopted it, but with their own twist. They didn't want their names associated with madness in any public way. So they commissioned bespoke asylums built on private estates, run by discreet doctors who understood that silence was golden and profitable. Let's take a stroll through one of them, Brislington House, near Bristol. From the outside, it looked like a country mansion, sweeping lawns, a lake, perfectly symmetrical gardens. Inside, though, it was a small, contained world. Male and female patients were kept apart, of course. Meals were served on fine china. There were libraries, drawing rooms, even billiard tables, but every door was locked. Every servant watched. Every window had bars carefully disguised behind the curtains. It was luxury. Yes, but also captivity, dressed in silk gloves. Aristocrats sent their relatives here quietly. A duchess who cried too much. A viscount's son who talked to invisible friends. A colonel's wife who kept forgetting who she was, and the language used was deliberately vague. People didn't say, "She's insane." They said, "She's unwell, she's taking rest in the country." Or the ever-popular, "She's suffering from nerves," because, apparently, nerves could explain just about anything. Now, let's float over to London, where the most exclusive addresses had private madhouses tucked behind high walls. One of the most notorious was Moorcroft House, in the genteel village of Hillingdon. It treated lords, ladies, and the occasional royal cousin with extreme discretion. Its clientele included a long list of melancholics, people suffering from what we'd now call depression or bipolar disorder. But the treatments were creative ice baths to shock the brain, opium for calm, and if that didn't work, a little electric stimulation, because nothing says recovery like being zapped by a Victorian battery while wearing lace. But of all the noble families of the 19th century, the British royal family was perhaps the most invested in keeping up appearances. After all, They'd seen what madness could do to a monarchy. King George III's illness nearly destabilized the country. So, by Queen Victoria's time, the rule was simple. Mental illness must never be spoken of. Victoria herself was famously unsympathetic to it. When one of her daughters, Princess Alice, wrote to her about feeling anxious and overwhelmed, Victoria responded briskly that everyone feels sad sometimes and she should simply stop thinking about it. Very therapeutic. But mental instability still haunted the dynasty. Victoria's own descendants were scattered across Europe, ruling in Germany, Russia, Greece, carrying her genes, and possibly a touch of hereditary melancholy wherever they went. And of course, there's the Prince John story, fast-forwarding a bit to the early 20th century, but it fits perfectly here. Prince John was the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. He suffered from epilepsy and learning difficulties. At first, he was kept at home with the family, but as he grew older, his fits became more severe. So quietly, he was moved to a secluded cottage on the Sandringham estate, with a nurse and a gardener for company. The royal family visited him occasionally. When he died at 13, newspapers described it as a sudden illness, and his existence faded into royal footnotes. He was never presented in public, never photographed officially, just quietly edited out. It was the 20th century, but the mindset was still medieval. Hide the flaws, maintain the facade smile for the portrait. Let's drift to France, where the same pattern played out with a little more flair, because French nobility always did drama better in Paris. The 19th century saw a boom in maisons de santé, literally houses of health, elegant clinics for the rich, often disguised as spa retreats or private boarding houses. Doctors there developed reputations like celebrity chefs. One might specialize in female hysteria, another in melancholic nobles. Their waiting lists were full of marquises, countesses, and occasionally a visiting Russian prince with an inconvenient addiction to absinthe, hydrotherapy, morphine, music, and sometimes hypnotism, because nothing soothed a paranoid duke like a stranger waving a pocket watch at him. One of the strangest French cases involved the Duchesse de Choiseul, confined for over 20 years in a private clinic near Paris. Her madness consisted mainly of refusing to marry the man her family chose for her. After years of isolation, she became genuinely delusional, convinced she was being poisoned by her servants. The family, satisfied that she was safely out of sight, continued attending operas and salons, occasionally paying her bills, but otherwise pretending she didn't exist. It's haunting, really. How many so-called mad women were simply women who refused to obey? Back in England, the 19th century was also the golden age of diagnosing women with hysteria. That word covered everything: sadness, frustration, sexual repression, postnatal depression, even boredom. If a woman spoke too much, she was hysterical. If she didn't speak enough, she was melancholic. If she wanted independence, well, clearly she was mad. Doctors like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris and Silas were Mitchell in America built entire careers around treating upper-class women who were simply unhappy in their cages. The rest cure became fashionable. Total isolation, no reading, no talking, no activity. It was meant to calm the nerves. Mostly, it just broke people. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who experienced it herself, later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, which is basically a polite Victorian scream about the whole thing. Meanwhile, in Russia, noble madness had an imperial flair. The Romanovs, like most European dynasties, had more than a few unstable branches. There was Grand Duke Nikolai Konstantinovich, cousin of Tsar Alexander III, charming, brilliant, and completely unpredictable. He once stole valuable diamonds from his mother's icons and gave them to his mistress. When caught, he calmly explained that God told him to do it. The family's response: silence. He was declared insane and shipped off to Central Asia, where he lived out his life as a kind of gilded prisoner, surrounded by servants and tropical plants, his own personal Siberian spa. Even later, the Romanovs' obsession with controlling their image led them straight into disaster. When Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the throne, was born with hemophilia, the condition was treated as a state secret. Not mental illness this time, but the same principle applied. Hide it, deny it, pretend everything's fine. It wasn't. Alexei's illness led his desperate mother, Empress Alexandra, to turn to mystics for help, including the infamous Rasputin. And the rest, as they say, is history. Or at least a very long and awkward chapter of it. It's fascinating how consistent the pattern is. Across countries, across centuries, the same formula. Mental illness in the lower classes was something to fear or mock. In the upper classes, it was something to conceal, and the concealment itself often made it worse. There are stories of nobles recovering from fits of melancholy, only to be kept in confinement anyway, because the family didn't want to risk another scandal. Some spent decades that way, their entire adult lives reduced to polite silence. Their names might appear in family archives, followed by a vague note, "died abroad," which usually meant they died in one of those quiet asylums, surrounded by wallpaper and locked doors. By the late 1800s, though, science began to catch up. Psychiatry emerged as a real medical field, flawed, yes, but at least it tried to understand instead of just punish. And with it came a slow, uneasy shift. The upper classes began to talk, very cautiously, about nervous conditions. The language softened. Madness became fatigue. Hysteria became melancholia. It was still secret, but now it came with a hint of sympathy, of course. It helped that so many famous people were having breakdowns. Poets, artists, philosophers. Suddenly, mental illness had a touch of romanticism. You weren't insane. You were sensitive, tragic, interesting, and if you were very lucky or very rich, you could have your crisis in a well-furnished sanatorium overlooking Lake Geneva, rather than a damp cellar in York. One of the most famous of these retreats was Bellevue, near Kreuzlingen in Switzerland. It treated artists, nobles, and the occasional overworked industrialist. Its patients included people like Ludwig bin, who later treated Nietzsche himself. Bellevue offered baths, music therapy, long walks, and views of the Alps. The idea was to heal through beauty, which sounds nice, until you remember that most of its patients weren't allowed to leave. So even as psychiatry modernized, the old aristocratic instinct remained. If someone in the family broke down, get them somewhere quiet and never speak of it again. This habit lingered well into the 20th century. In Britain, as late as the 1950s, there were still noble families, quietly institutionalizing relatives for embarrassing behavior. Sometimes it was genuine schizophrenia. Sometimes it was simply homosexuality. Sometimes it was nothing more than being inconveniently outspoken. The class might change, but the silence, that heavy velvet silence, stayed the same. Let's rest here for a moment. Somewhere in the dim light between Victorian respectability and modern psychiatry, in Part 3, we'll drift gently into the 20th century to explore how these hidden asylums evolved into private clinics for royals and movie stars, how noble families tried to rewrite their own history, and how some of those long-lost mad relatives finally came to light. If you've somehow made it this far without drifting off, congratulations. You're either a true history fan or you've had too much caffeine. Either way, settle in. Tonight, we're sliding softly into the 20th century, the era when aristocratic madness went from candlelit secrecy to fluorescent discretion. Corsets had loosened, palaces had plumbing, and Freud had appeared on the scene with a cigar and some very strange ideas about your mother. But the instinct to hide mental illness among the rich and titled, oh, that one survived. In fact, it simply evolved. Let's begin in Britain, where the monarchy had mastered the art of selective storytelling. After Queen Victoria's long reign, the royal family entered the 1900s with a new image, modern, dutiful, and impeccably sane. At least on the outside. Behind the scenes, however, there were still rooms no one talked about, and relatives quietly airbrushed from history. We already mentioned Prince John, the epileptic son of George V, but he wasn't the only royal hidden away for health reasons. Far less known are Nerissa and Catherine, Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's nieces. They were the daughters of the Queen Mother's brother, and from birth, both girls had significant learning disabilities. In the 1940s, when the family could have afforded the best care in the world, they were instead sent to Royal Earlswood Asylum, a large, state-run institution for mental defectives, as the term then went. Official genealogies listed the sisters as dead. They lived there quietly for decades, largely forgotten, until a newspaper discovered them in the 1980s, still alive, still in care, and still believing that one day their family would come for them. They never did, and that's the modern version of what the Habsburgs and Bourbons had done centuries earlier. Don't confront the problem. Just bury it in bureaucracy. Let's drift gently to Sweden, where another royal scandal was similarly smoothed over in the early 20th century. Prince Eric of Sweden, the youngest son of King Gustav V, was diagnosed with epilepsy and a developmental disorder. At a time when the Swedish monarchy was obsessed with appearing healthy and progressive, this was quietly catastrophic. So, Eric was removed from public life. He lived in a villa on the countryside, surrounded by nurses, with only occasional visits from family. When he died at 29, the palace released a short statement. The prince has long suffered from ill health, and that was that. No mention of his condition, no photographs, just a polite, eternal silence. The 20th century also gave us a new, more scientific way to hide aristocratic madness: psychiatric clinics. The old asylums were gone, but their spirit lived on, now dressed in white walls, ticking clocks, and polite euphemisms. The Swiss led the way. By the 1930s, places like Kusnecht Clinic and Bellevue Sanatorium were hosting a curious mix of exiled nobles, anxious industrialists, and depressed poets for the very rich. These clinics offered rest cures that sounded wonderfully vague: a little electrotherapy, a little morphine, a little time away from the press. If you had enough money, your madness became tasteful. A nervous breakdown wasn't a scandal. It was a spa retreat. And speaking of Switzerland, it became the unofficial refuge for Europe's emotionally exhausted upper class. Queen Marie of Romania spent her declining years there, trying to recover her vitality. A few steps away, aristocrats from Austria, Germany, and France were quietly undergoing treatments for melancholy, neurasthenia, and various inconvenient addictions. It was like the world's most exclusive waiting room for people who couldn't quite admit they were human. Meanwhile, in France, the maisons de santé of the 19th century evolved into elite psychiatric hospitals. One of the most famous was Sainte-Anne in Paris, where artists and aristocrats mingled. Under medical supervision, it became almost fashionable for the upper crust to take the waters at a mental clinic, as long as the word asylum wasn't used. Even members of the Bonaparte family, descendants of Napoleon, sought discreet treatment there when the family's legendary egos began collapsing under their own weight. The French had mastered the art of turning madness into melancholy, something poetic, almost elegant. A nervous collapse was une crise de l'âme, a crisis of the soul. Sounds much better than complete breakdown, doesn't it? Now, let's glide east to Russia again, or what was left of it after the revolution, when the Romanovs fell in 1917. The new Soviet regime had very little patience for noble delicacy. Madness was no longer a private family shame. It was a political liability. Many surviving nobles fled to Europe, bringing with them their trauma, their titles, and their mental fragility. Paris was full of exiled princes giving piano lessons, grand duchesses running cafes, and dukes drinking themselves into oblivion. Some ended up in the same Swiss clinics as their former monarchs. Others simply vanished, lost in Septoria, or quietly buried under assumed names. If madness had once been hidden behind palace walls, now it hid in cheap Parisian boarding houses. Under the hum of electric trams, the world wars only deepened this pattern. After 1918, half of Europe's nobility was either bankrupt, displaced, or simply obsolete. Those who remained clung harder than ever to appearances. They couldn't flaunt power anymore, so they flaunted composure. To break down was to admit defeat. So the silencing continued, even as psychiatry became mainstream. By the 1950s, the upper classes had embraced tranquilizers instead of asylums. A discreet prescription for Valium replaced the padded room. If a duchess was unwell, she simply went on holiday and came back smiling faintly. But sometimes the silence cracked. In 1957, a scandal shook the British establishment when journalist Barbara Taylor Bradford revealed the existence of several forgotten noble relatives in asylums, including the Beausoleil sisters we mentioned earlier. The public was horrified, but the palace said little. A few decades later, the Crown would dramatize the story, portraying the sisters as victims of a system obsessed with dignity over decency. And the sad truth, that depiction was generous, because their story wasn't unique. It was just one that finally leaked. Let's float briefly to America, where the same social instinct arrived in a new form. The old European titles didn't mean much there, but money did. And so the wealthy elite of the early 20th century, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans, built their own private sanatoria. Places like McLean Hospital in Massachusetts became the American equivalent of a noble asylum. Manicured lawns, piano rooms, and a clientele that included both heiresses and poets inside. They practiced rest therapy, psychoanalysis, and electroshock, all with exquisite discretion. Because whether you were a European duke or a Boston socialite, the rule remained the same: keep the breakdown quiet. Back in Europe, the later 20th century began to expose what centuries of secrecy had hidden. Historians started digging through family archives, and the results were uncomfortable. In Austria, it emerged that several late Habsburg relatives had been institutionalized for decades, without trial, some surviving into the 1950s, living in old convent hospitals under assumed names. In France, genealogists found dozens of aristocrats listed as deceased while still very much alive in private clinics. In Germany, records revealed that noble families sometimes colluded with the Nazi-era euthanasia program to quietly dispose of defective relatives. It was the darkest possible continuation of that old instinct to hide weakness. And then came the Windsors, the British royal family. Entering the media age by the 1970s, mental health was no longer completely taboo, but it was still inconvenient. When Princess Margaret began suffering from depression and substance abuse, the palace called it stress. When Princess Diana sought therapy in the 1980s, the press framed it as scandal. But unlike their predecessors, these women spoke, or at least hinted, about what was happening. For the first time in centuries, royal madness wasn't entirely hidden. It was whispered, photographed, televised. You could almost hear the ghosts of their ancestors clutching their pearls. And yet, even today, traces of that old aristocratic secrecy remain. Royal biographies still skip over sensitive medical issues. Family trees still quietly omit inconvenient branches. The modern version of the private asylum is the private clinic in Switzerland, discreet, scenic, and very expensive. If you check into one as a royal or billionaire, you're not institutionalized. You're simply resting. The language has evolved, but the impulse to treat mental illness as something that must be concealed, controlled, and aestheticized never quite went away. It's strange, isn't it? For centuries, these families ruled by divine right, claiming God had chosen them to lead. And yet, the one thing they couldn't face was their own human frailty. Instead, they built walls around it, literal and metaphorical. From the damp castles of medieval France to the polished clinics of modern Zurich, the story has been the same. Hide it, deny it, make it look beautiful. Let's drift for a moment into the quietest space of all, the emotional vacuum that sits between privilege and pain. Imagine being one of those forgotten relatives. You're born into luxury. Your cradle has gold trim. Your toys are ivory and silk. And then, one day, the doors close. The servants stop speaking your name. You're taken to a place with white walls and soft voices. And they tell you this is for your own good. Years pass, decades. The world moves on. Your family smiles for portraits, waving from balconies. while you fade quietly in a room that smells of lavender and dust. That's not just a tragic story, it's the quiet, recurring heartbeat of aristocratic history. So when we look back at those portraits, the elegant kings, the flawless queens, the endless lineages, remember that many of them were built on silence. Behind the grandeur was a secret network of asylums, clinics, and quiet rooms where the family's mistakes were kept out of sight. It wasn't evil, exactly, just deeply human fear, dressed up in silk. Fear of shame, fear of weakness, fear that if the world saw the cracks, the crown would crumble. And that brings us to now, to the modern world, where those same families finally speak about mental health, where princes talk about therapy, where duchesses start foundations for awareness. It's progress, slow, delicate, centuries overdue. But maybe it means the era of secret asylums is finally ending, or at least becoming something we can talk about without whispering. So tonight, as you drift off, think of all those hidden wings, those candlelit rooms, those locked gardens where the aristocracy hid its ghosts. History isn't just about wars and crowns. It's also about what people were too afraid to admit, and in the long, strange saga of noble madness, the loudest sound was always silence. Soft exhale. All right, that's enough melancholy for one night. Thanks for listening, or for sleeping through it, which honestly is kind of the point. Good night from the sleepless historian. Hey, you're still here. That's impressive. Most people tapped out around the word inbreeding, but you stayed. So, let's talk about the one subject even the nobles themselves whispered about, the blood dot, because when you spend hundreds of years hiding madness, eventually it starts hiding inside you. The curse of the pure blood royal families loved the idea of pure bloodlines. They said it proved divine favor, that their blood carried something sacred. But nature has a cruel sense of humor. The tighter they guarded that blood, the weaker it became. We've all heard of the Habsburg jaw, that heavy protruding chin that appeared generation after generation. But that jaw was only the visible symptom. What couldn't be seen were the mental effects: epilepsy, depression, learning disabilities, even psychotic breaks, all common among royal houses that intermarried too closely. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg king, was the ultimate warning. His family tree was more of a family circle. He couldn't walk properly, couldn't chew his food, and spoke like a child well into adulthood. Doctors called him the bewitched. He was, biologically speaking, an echo, the end of a long loop. They hid him in palaces, surrounded by priests and incense, praying the curse away. But it wasn't a curse. It was genetics, madness by design. The tragedy is that no one understood heredity yet. When madness appeared in a royal line, they blamed everything: witchcraft, bad air, sinful ancestors, everything except biology. So when a king's sister showed fits or melancholy, she was hidden, not helped. When a prince heard voices, they brought priests, not doctors, and by hiding them, they protected the illusion, not the person. That illusion lasted centuries, until the science finally caught up in the late 19th century. Medicine started asking dangerous questions. What if insanity ran in families? What if blue blood wasn't divine, just recessive? And suddenly, the entire myth of noble superiority began to crack. Doctors started publishing quiet reports about degeneration in the upper classes. There were even whispered theories that inbreeding among royals had accelerated certain hereditary mental illnesses, manic depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy. For the first time, people began to wonder if royalty itself was a genetic experiment gone wrong. The myth of divine sanity yet, even as science peeled back the layers, the royal image remained spotless. You see, power isn't just about armies or money. It's about narrative. As long as the story stayed clean, as long as portraits looked serene, coronations glittered, and official bulletins said the queen is in good health, the truth didn't matter. And so, the myth of composure survived. Even now, centuries later, that expectation still lingers. Modern royals may go to therapy, but they still have to look perfect, still have to smile, still have to pretend that the ghosts are gone. The inheritance of silence. What happens when you spend 500 years teaching your children to never show weakness? You create a bloodline allergic to honesty. Even after the asylums closed, that emotional inheritance remained. The old noble families became experts at self-control, poised, polished, but brittle inside. In interviews, you can sometimes see it, that flicker behind the eyes. A rehearsed calm that's been passed down like jewelry. It's the same calm that once kept secrets behind locked doors. Only now it's polite, media-trained, and smiling for cameras. The forgotten and the remembered. What about those who didn't make it into the portraits? The mad cousins, the epileptic sons, the melancholic daughters who never married. Most were erased completely. But in archives, their names still appear in the margins, confined for reasons of delicacy, sent abroad for treatment, deceased without issue. Each phrase is a euphemism for erased, and yet they were the truth of those dynasties. The hidden cost of perfection. The price paid by the quietest members of the family. The science they never knew. If those families had known what we know now, that mental illness isn't a curse, that genetics isn't destiny, maybe things would have been different. Maybe they wouldn't have locked away their sons. Maybe their daughters wouldn't have been medicated into silence. Maybe madness would have been treated, not hidden. But the science came too late for them, and too early for us to forget. From blue blood to common flesh, the irony is beautiful in a bleak way. After all that obsession with bloodlines, after centuries of marrying cousins to preserve their divine spark, most of Europe's royal families eventually married commoners. Genetically, that probably saved them. Emotionally, it might have saved them too. Because now, for the first time in history, royals could admit they were human. They could fall in love, fall apart, and even occasionally talk about it. That's the quiet miracle of modernity. The old aristocracies finally became mortal. The last secret. What's left now? The palaces remain. The portraits still hang. The crowns still shine. But the ghosts have names again. Historians are piecing together what was erased, the real people behind the polite euphemisms. And as those stories surface, something beautiful happens. Silence turns into memory. Shame turns into empathy. The noble families may have spent centuries hiding their madness, but in doing so, they left behind a map, a shadow history of fear and denial that mirrors all of us, because we all come from people who hid things, just not with crowns on. Every old palace has a certain smell. It isn't perfume or dust. It's the smell of people who never got to leave. The aristocrats hid their troubled relatives behind thick walls. We, in our own way, hide ours behind polite small talk and digital filters. It's the same instinct, just with better lighting. The Victorians had drawing room nerves. We call it burnout. Different words. Same tremor, the palace within when you walk through places like Shinbrun or Windsor today. There's a hush that feels heavier than it should. Guides talk about tapestries and dinner menus. But if you listen between their sentences, you can still feel the old architecture doing its other job, keeping certain stories in a door that never opens in public tours, a stairway that ends abruptly, a window bricked over because someone once sat there, year after year, watching people go by. It makes you wonder how many of those rooms we've built inside ourselves. All those parts of us we've labeled not ready for company. The quiet revolution in the 20th century. Medicine began to untangle the threads that the royals had knotted. Psychiatry replaced exorcism. Genetics replaced superstition. But knowledge didn't erase the reflex to hide. Even now, entire families still whisper about an aunt who isn't quite right, or a cousin who went away for a bit. They might not have marble corridors, but they have the same instinct for secrecy. And maybe that's why stories about royal madness still feel personal, because it isn't really about crowns or castles. It's about what happens when any of us start believing that love depends on composure. The modern bloodlines royal families today attend therapy, sponsor mental health charities, talk openly about stress. It feels modern, progressive, and it is. But it's also a kind of apology, centuries overdue. Those public conversations are how they pay back the silence that built their empires. Each time a prince admits to anxiety on camera, it undoes a little of the old fear that once sealed a sister behind velvet curtains. So, when you hear that royal confession quoted on the evening news, don't roll your eyes. It's not publicity. It's exorcism by honesty. What remains and still, the architecture stands. You can't bulldoze heritage, even when it was designed to hide pain. So the walls stay. Tourists wander through the same halls where whispers used to live. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it's good to keep the reminders around, to see how easily elegance can become camouflage. Because history isn't a moral lesson carved in marble. It's a mirror with a few centuries of fingerprints on it, the gentle lesson if there's a moral hiding at the end of this long, sleepy walk. It's this: madness isn't the shame. Silence is that the nobles built secret asylums to protect their reputations. We build smaller ones in our heads for the same reason. Different scale, same blueprint. The good news is, we get to renovate. We can open the windows, label things properly, stop pretending that fragility disqualifies us from dignity. And maybe that's the real ending. Not a tragic one, just quieter. Understanding is always a kind of peace. Soft breath of music. A clock ticking somewhere far away. So, if you're listening to this in the dark, letting your eyes close, remember that you live in a time when no one has to hide behind a title or a locked door. You can name your ghosts, and they lose their teeth. That's progress. It's not flashy. It just hums softly in the background, like a palace at midnight. When all the lights finally go out. Sleep well. You've reached the end of the story, and the start of forgetting to be ashamed of being human. Hey, still awake? that's fine. These kinds of stories have a way of lingering. They don't end when the words stop. They just change rooms. There's something strange about spending an evening wandering through other people's secrets. You start to hear echoes, not just from the nobles we talked about, but from the ordinary people who lived underneath them. For every royal who lost their mind in a golden cage, there were hundreds of servants who quietly kept the lock turned. They ironed sheets, brought meals, and pretended not to hear the screaming behind heavy doors. They knew everything, and they said nothing, because in those days, loyalty wasn't about truth. It was about keeping appearances polished. If you spoke, you risked everything. If you stayed quiet, you could keep your job, maybe feed your family. And so silence was inherited, generation to generation, just like the madness itself. The caretakers of secrecy will find them in old records, listed simply as attendants. They were the ones who washed the linens, fed the confined, and wrote tiny notes for the family physician. They were the invisible scaffolding that held up royal sanity, or the illusion of it. There are stories, whispered through letters, of servants who stayed for decades beside the unwell noble. One old attendant of George III kept a journal where he described the king's long nights of confusion, writing simply, "He believes he is in heaven. We let him think so." It's such a small sentence, but there's something kind in it, almost tender, even when the system was cruel. Individuals inside it sometimes weren't. They couldn't free their patients, but they could make the cage a little softer. The paper trail of denial centuries later. Archivists began opening those sealed family files. Inside, they found exactly what you'd expect: medication lists, physicians' notes, and the kind of gentle euphemisms that only nobles could invent. Her Highness experiences an excess spirit, translation, manic episodes. The Duke has become contemplative to a fault, translation, catatonic depression. They had a way of wrapping horror in velvet, as if language itself could disinfect what was happening. And yet, even in those notes, you can feel compassion leaking through the formality. Doctors trying to explain the inexplicable without losing their jobs or their heads. The puzzle of public image when historians read those papers now. They're not just decoding illnesses, they're decoding branding. The monarchy was the first influencer culture. Everything depended on maintaining the image. If a nobleman went mad, the press might hear. If the press heard, the people might doubt divine right. If divine right cracked, the entire hierarchy shook. So every sigh, every hallucination, every delusion had to be edited out of the narrative. It's a weird kind of proto-public relations work. A world where reputations were more valuable than lives. Mirrors that. Letha portraits didn't help. Those serene oil faces staring from gilded frames, none of them ever looked tired or anxious or lost. But behind every one of those faces was a long list of instructions for the painter. Make the eyes calm, hide the tremor in the hands, depict the complexion as healthy. And so they did. They painted an entire class into eternal composure. If you stand in a gallery long enough, you can almost hear the tension humming through the brushstrokes, the effort it must have taken to appear so tranquil while history was slowly collapsing under its own perfection. The shift toward light. By the early 20th century, the facade finally started to crumble. War broke out, empires fell, and with them went the illusion of divine sanity. When the Russian imperial family was executed in 1918, the world saw not gods, but frightened, fragile people. When George III's letters were published, they revealed confusion, faith, and fear, not madness, but humanity. And that's how the curtain began to lift, not with rebellion, but with recognition. Why it still matters. It's easy to treat these stories like distant curiosities. Ah, yes, those poor, inbred monarchs of yore, but the shape of their silence still fits neatly into ours. We might not have castles, but we have reputations to maintain. We might not have attendants, but we have social media followers. And every time we hide a crack in the facade, every time we choose appearance over honesty, we're reenacting a very old play. The only difference is, now we know the ending. The final whisper. So, if tonight's story leaves you a little heavy, let it. History's lullabies aren't meant to make us forget. They're meant to help us remember gently. Every hidden room we uncover, every diary we read, is a reminder that sanity was never a privilege of kings. It's a spectrum we all drift along in our own quiet palaces of thought. Soft piano note, lingering, close your eyes. Picture one of those vast, echoing corridors again. Now imagine a door slowly opening, no locks, no guards, just light spilling into a room that's been dark for centuries. That's what understanding looks like. That's what history sounds like when it finally exhales. You've reached the end of this long, quiet unraveling, a bedtime story for the descendants of everyone who was ever told to keep it together. So breathe. The walls are thinner now, and somewhere even the ghosts are sleeping better. Good night. From the sleepless historian, soft hum returns. Barely audible, the sound of wind through curtains. A clock ticking in another room, still here. Good. The story's technically over, but history never stops exactly where you want it to. It leaves quiet threads dangling, little questions that don't fit neatly into the ending. So, before you drift off, let's follow one last thread, the one that connects all those locked rooms to the world outside them. When the noble asylums began to empty in the 1800s, no one really knew what to do with the people who came out. Some went to hospitals, some went home, some simply disappeared into the new cities that were swelling with smoke and industry for the first time. Madness wasn't hidden by gold ceilings. It was standing on street corners, selling matches or whispering to itself in parks. The world had changed, but compassion hadn't quite caught up. From secret wings to public wards, governments slowly realized they needed institutions of their own. So they built them, massive, cold, symmetrical buildings meant to look orderly, to calm the public as much as the patients. But those walls carried the same philosophy as the palaces that came before. Containment over care. Doctors still used euphemisms. Families still sent their relatives away quietly. The difference was scale. Now, it wasn't a few hidden wings for nobles. It was entire cities of silence for everyone else. Progress, of a sort. The fading of blue blood by the early 1900s. The last generation of truly isolated aristocrats was fading away. World wars burned through their illusions. Kings became figureheads. Queens became symbols. And the people who once ruled half the earth started to look uncomfortably human. You can almost feel the shift when you read their letters. The tone changes. Fewer proclamations, more questions. Less certainty, more doubt. It's as if after centuries of pretending to be divine, the royal families collectively exhaled and said, "We're tired." The echo in the common heart, that tiredness spread. Because hiding fragility isn't just a royal problem, it's a human one. We've inherited the same strange reflex. Smile when you want to scream. Compose yourself when you need to collapse. It's the same etiquette, just without the tiaras. When you feel the pressure to appear fine, to polish yourself before you're allowed to exist, that's the ghost of every noble who ever sat behind a locked door, wondering what would happen if they didn't pretend anymore. Small freedoms. The irony is that the cure for all that old aristocratic madness wasn't science alone, it was permission. Permission to speak. Permission to be ordinary. Permission to not be composed every waking minute. It took revolutions, wars, and social collapse, but eventually that permission trickled down to everyone now. You can say you're anxious without being sent to a sanatorium. You can cry in public without forfeiting your dignity. That's the quiet inheritance of all those silenced people. They didn't get to heal, but they handed us the vocabulary. What remains of the palaces? A few of the old noble asylums still stand. Some are museums. Others are luxury hotels. If you stay in one, you'll probably see polished floors, warm lamps, and rooms with names like the East Wing Suite. What you won't see are the iron bars that used to line the windows. They've been replaced with curtains. The same sunlight pours in, but it falls on tourists now, not captives. Time doesn't erase what happened, it just redecorates it. The final lesson, history's best kept secret, isn't that the nobles were mad. It's that everyone was pretending not to be. And maybe that's the one useful thing to take from all of this. Madness was never proof of weakness, only of being too sensitive to survive the performance. If you've ever felt that same exhaustion, the one that comes from trying to be hard to stay composed, congratulations. You've felt the echo of blue blood, and the cure is the same one they never found: to stop performing. Soft music fades lower. The rhythm of breathing matches the narration. So tonight, when you finally turn out the light, remember that somewhere in the DNA of history, there's a sigh of relief happening. Doors opening, walls softening, people being allowed to be strange and imperfect in the open air. It took us a few centuries to get here, but we did. Sleep well, traveler. You've reached the quietest part of the story, the part where the past finally stops whispering and the present starts to hum. Sound fades to silence. Faint closing piano theme goodnight from the sleepless historian. Soft, ambient tone lingers, the kind that makes you feel like you're floating somewhere between a dream and a museum. You're still here. Good. That means your mind hasn't quite let go yet, and that's all right. History always leaves a few ghosts behind, and tonight they still have a few quiet things to tell us. So, let's keep drifting. One last wander through the candlelit corridors of forgotten nobility. Part 8. The Ghosts in the Wallpaper. You ever walk through an old estate in Europe, one that's been turned into a heritage property or a wellness retreat? You might notice something strange. Everything feels too calm, too polished, as if the air itself has agreed not to remember anything unpleasant. But behind that tranquility lies a centuries-long effort to erase embarrassment and madness. More than anything, was considered an embarrassment. The language of disguise you could tell how uncomfortable the aristocracy was with the idea of insanity by the way they talked about it. They rarely used the word mad. They said, "She's delicate, he's melancholic, she has a nervous temperament," or, my personal favorite, "He's resting abroad," which usually meant, "He's in a private facility behind 10-foot hedges, and please, for the love of God, don't ask where." It's almost poetic how far they'd go to preserve the illusion of dignity. They rewrote reality in euphemisms, layer by layer, until madness became invisible, even as it ran the family estate. The inheritance of silence. There's a saying that money doesn't buy happiness, which is true, but it does buy privacy. For centuries, nobles weaponized that privacy. They could afford to rewrite their own narratives, to hide a daughter's breakdown, to exile a brother who wouldn't stop pacing the halls at night, to pretend that strange laughter echoing from the tower was just the wind. They built their own version of history, spotless and composed. And we inherited that too, the habit of editing our pain before showing it to anyone else. Every "I'm fine" you've ever said while falling apart a little inside. That's the echo of centuries of trained composure. The noblewoman who forgot herself. There's one small story, almost forgotten, about a French duchess named Louise Adela de Bourbon. She was born into one of the oldest families in France. Immense wealth, endless etiquette, and absolutely no privacy. By her 20s, her letters became erratic. She withdrew from court life, muttered to herself in the gardens, and refused to eat in company. So her family quietly moved her to a private convent, one of those hybrid religious retreats that were actually early asylums. There, she lived out the rest of her days, technically a nun, but in reality, a woman whose mind had quietly collapsed under the weight of expectation when she died. Her obituary simply read, "She preferred solitude," which, if you translate from noblespeak, means she went mad. And we made sure you'd never hear about it. The gentlemen in the attic, not all aristocrats, were locked away. Some were contained in many great houses. A wing or attic room would be repurposed for indoor exercise, a polite term for keeping someone upstairs with the curtains drawn. They were fed, clothed, and occasionally visited, but they weren't allowed to leave. A visitor might ask about a missing son or cousin and be told, "Oh, he's studying abroad," which might be true, in the sense that his mind had indeed departed. One English earl even paid an actor to impersonate his brother in public, so no one would know the real one was confined to a small, wall-papered cell on the 3rd floor. Politeness, apparently, could be crueler than chains. The royal mind games. Even royal families played this game of decorum. Queen Victoria's uncle, George III, famously went mad, though modern historians think it might have been porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that caused hallucinations and violent outbursts. His family tried everything: seclusion, medication, forced restraint. At one point, he was chained to his chair while physicians took notes. But when the public asked how their king was doing, official bulletins said things like, "His Majesty is in high spirits and continues to show remarkable fortitude," which was a nice way of saying, "He's currently screaming at his curtains." The cruelty wasn't in the treatment, though that was grim, but in the performance of normalcy. No one was allowed to admit what was happening, and that pretense became the tradition. When genius was confused from amnista, line between mad and eccentric was paper-thin for the upper class. If a poor man painted stars on his ceiling and spoke to invisible friends, he was insane. If a nobleman did it, he was a visionary. It's an oddly comforting thought that all those grand manor houses full of marble and portraits were also full of whispering, pacing, and sleeplessness. They just called it temperament. Lord Byron. Mad, but poetic, so it was fine. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Mad, but built fairy tale castles, so he became romanticized. Same condition. Different furniture. The final secret what the noble asylums really reveal isn't just how people treated mental illness. It's how desperate humans are to maintain control of the story. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Because even today, with all our understanding, all our progress, we still reach for the same instinct. We filter, we edit, we hide. It's not because we're dishonest, it's because we want to be loved. And love seems easier when you look fine. But if you listen carefully in the silence between words, or the stillness before sleep, you can still hear the echo of those locked rooms whispering. You don't have to pretend anymore. Music fades into a slow piano line, barely audible, and maybe that's where the story was heading all along. Not to shock you, or to depress you, but to remind you that even the people history called noble were just frightened, complicated, breakable creatures trying to survive in a world that demanded perfection. The walls they built were never to keep others out. They were to keep shame in, and eventually even those walls crumbled. A slow breath, so now, with history finally quiet, maybe you can let go of your own walls, too, because tonight, in the dark, you're allowed to rest. You're allowed to be uncomposed. And if that's madness, then maybe madness was never the problem. Soft sound of rain fades in, like a lullaby. Sleep well, historian. The past is at peace for now. You can be, hey, still awake. That's okay. You're exactly where you need to be. If history has a lullaby, this is it. The part where centuries of secrets finally let out a long sigh. For hundreds of years, aristocrats hid their fragility behind locked doors, padded walls, and polite language. Madness was never the crime. Exposure was. And because their lives were so closely watched, the pressure to appear composed was absolute. Lessons from the locked rooms. If you trace the lineage of secrecy, you notice something fascinating. The strategies nobles used to hide mental illness, isolation, euphemism, avoidance didn't die with the asylums. They traveled quietly into our homes. We might not live in castles, but the expectation to look fine persists. Post the perfect photo. Reply cheerfully to every message. Smile through exhaustion. We inherited the same delicate fear of vulnerability that had plagued kings and queens. It's encoded into behavior, etiquette, and family culture, a subtle echo of the past. Modern mirrors. Today's world offers something the old nobles never had. Choice, psychology, therapy, medication, self-awareness. Tools that were once unimaginable are now at our fingertips. Where the royal families once chained or sequestered relatives, we can seek understanding. Where they whispered and hid, we can talk openly, yet the echo remains. We still hesitate. We still prefer "I'm fine" over "I need help." We still build little private wings inside our own minds. And in a strange way, that makes the history feel alive, not distant. The fragility behind the throne. If there's one persistent theme through all these centuries, it's this: power and fragility are not opposites. The kings who built castles in Bavaria, the queens who withdrew into quiet chambers, the princes hidden behind euphemisms and polite language, all of them were fragile humans trying to navigate a world that demanded perfection. And when they failed, the system told them, hide, quiet the mind, close the doors. Don't let the world see it's comforting and sad all at once, to realize that the same impulse still lives in us. The gift of awareness. The difference now is that we can see it. We can notice the patterns. We can acknowledge the echoes. We can, slowly, remove the need for secrecy. And that's a remarkable inheritance. The past may have silenced them, but it also left us a guide. Fragility is not shameful. Vulnerability is not failure. Humanity is not optional, a quiet ending. So, as you lie there, letting your eyes drift shut, remember the locked rooms, the whispered euphemisms, the careful portraits. Remember the people who were hidden and the people who hid them. And understand this: you don't have to repeat history. You don't have to perform endlessly, polish endlessly, or hide endlessly. You can simply be. The old asylums, the gilded cages, the centuries of quiet suffering, they exist now only as lessons, not as commands, not as chains, just as stories. And like all good stories, they end quietly. Soft rain fades. Faint crackle of a fireplace or candle. Good night. Sleep, historian. You've carried the past with you tonight, and now you can let it rest. You've walked the corridors of kings and queens, heard their silent screams, and finally, you're allowed to close the door. From the sleepless historian, rest well.